It's virtual Mr. Peters today, our last cross-country meet, so I hopefully won't have to do this many more times. But today, I'm going to go over the bell ringer with you, and then I'm going to recap some things from yesterday, and then introduce what you're going to start today and do tomorrow as well. So first and foremost, the bell ringer here this morning, or afternoon. Two questions. What was the Stamp Act, and why might the colonists have been upset over the Stamp Act? And I gave you a little hint down here, a vocabulary word that we looked at yesterday. So first of all, the Stamp Act. It was pretty straightforward. It was one of the first taxes that was placed upon the colonists after the French and Indian War. And it was a tax that was basically required the colonists to purchase a stamp for paper documents, newspapers, legal documents, wills, land titles, those types of things. But everything down to as simple as something like a deck of playing cards had to have the British special stamp. So they were taxing all paper materials. And everyone used paper to some extent, so you'd be taxed. And the question here, why might some of the colonists have been upset by the Stamp Act? Well, I'm going to go back and reference our timeline. If you remember yesterday, I talked about this idea of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect was the idea that the British government pretty much left the colonists alone in America for about 150 years. And after the French and Indian War, that changed. Before this, they were not directly taxed. They only were taxed on their things they shipped into and out of the colonies. They had to, abide by some other rules, like they could only ship certain things to England and they could only buy certain things from England. But for the most part, they were allowed to function independently, start their own governments, tax their own people, all of that. But after the French and Indian War, when the British government feels they have pretty much saved the colonies from the Native Americans and the French, they think the colonies should pay their fair share in this. So this is one of those first taxes down here on the timeline, 1765, roughly when that occurred. And it was passed, but was quickly repealed because the colonists were very upset with this direct tax that had been placed on them, and they were starting to kind of boycott some of the British goods, and so the British government repealed those things. First thing I want to do is give some of you a minute to make sure you've written down these three vocabulary words. Some classes we only got to salutary neglect, but I want to make sure you get virtual representation in Parliament. Some of you chose to write it on the back of this Stamp Act reading. It's blank, that's fine. Some of you did it on a piece of notebook paper, that's fine, but I'm going to give you a minute to make sure you have all that down, because these are really important in discussing our overall essential question of were the American colonists justified in declaring their independence. There's two things that you'll need today and tomorrow. You might want to have your timeline out. You don't have to, but the timeline is very helpful. And you would have picked up the Stamp Act reading yesterday, and also this green sheet that has, it's our SOS summary. We've done these before. We're going to do two, one for both sides of this argument on the Stamp Act, so you'll have this whole sheet of paper. So the first thing I want to do is actually look at the pro-con Stamp Act paper, and I want to read the background, even though I went over this just a second ago. It says, for nearly 150 years, the only national taxes placed on the English colonies were import duties, or taxes, import taxes. Taxes on imported goods. However, after the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, England's national government was left with a huge debt. A bill was introduced in Parliament to tax the colonies to help pay that debt. The stamp tax would require colonists to purchase from the national government a stamp for all official documents, licenses, and newspapers. When the members of the Virginia House of Burgesses learned about the Stamp Act, they discussed a resolution opposing it. So we know in history that it does get repealed. But yesterday, in most classes, I introduced this chart. And it is on the back of the Stamp Act reading. And this chart is really interesting because what it shows is the tax burden on different places in the British Empire in 1765. And what we found out was that places like Great Britain and Ireland paid a larger proportion of the annual taxes than did the colonies. A bigger chunk of the tax burden prior to or right after the end of the French Indian War. And so this first direct tax will kind of change things. So what we know is that the Stamp Act occurred. What you're going to be doing is reading one argument for why the Stamp Act was fair, and a second argument saying that the Stamp Act was unfair. So you can already tell which side the arguments are on. The one that says the Stamp Act was fair is going to address the reasons why it was okay for the British government to do this, and when the one that the Stamp Act was unfair, it's going to talk about why they should not have imposed it on the American colonists. So you're going to read that. What you're going to do with your green sheet, and mine's white, yours should be green. You have a statement up here that says Great Britain's action of imposing the Stamp Act tax on the American colonists was fair of them to do. What you're going to do is gather evidence from both sides. The one that you would say I agree and that you disagree, and you'll find evidence that supports that claim. So I want to actually do this part together where it's Great Britain's actions for imposing the Stamp Act tax on the American colonists was fair of them to do. I want to go ahead and reword this in different words. Basically, and I'm going to do that in red so you can see it. Basically what this is saying is that it was okay, and you go ahead and write this on yours, it was okay for the British government to use the Stamp Act to raise money from the American colonists. So that is all that's really saying. That it was okay that the British government use the Stamp Act to raise money from the American colonists. Now, already on your sheet, I have circled on the first one here the agree statement. So you will put evidence that would support the fact that it was okay for the British to impose the Stamp Act on the American colonists to raise money. The second portion, this will be where you disagree. And you will provide facts for that there. Now already though, we know that you will find information that agrees that the Stamp Act is fair in the first article. The one that says the Stamp Act is fair. You will find that information in here. You will then find that it was unfair, that you disagree with the statement in the second one. The Stamp Act is unfair. So what I want you to do is you're going to read this, and using the bullet points that I have provided in the lines, you will provide textual evidence and facts from the source that support the opinion in each section.